Time now for Alice and I to give you a brief news review and look at the headlines from around the world. We'll start with Yemen, because Gulf News is not surprisingly leading with this. It's calling it the growing turmoil in the country, highlighting Yemen's call for help confronting the advancing Shia Houthi militia.
And the Wall Street Journal says investigators researching the cause of the air crash in the French Alps have extracted usable data from the jet's black box recorder.
The Financial Times is leading on Heinz's takeover of Kraft Foods, calling it the largest mergers and acquisitions deal of the year.
And the International New York Times speculates on whether the BBC's popular motoring programme Top Gear will survive after the main host Jeremy Clarkson was dropped following reports of an abusive fracker.
The Guardian covers the revelations of a former British police officer that during the 1990s, 10 government ministers considered to be a threat to national security were spied on by his department.
And the Telegraph features an educational debate about whether the recent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan should be taught as history in schools.
Joining us this morning, Mark Davies, CEO of Camberton Consultancy. Good morning, Mark.
Good morning, Edmund.
Morning.
Morning.
Yemen is, it's difficult to say whether it's the biggest mess in the Middle East, but it is just another example of this Shia-Sunni divide, which can now be found almost across possibly every Muslim country in the world.
Absolutely. It feels like it's the newest mess, but of course this is the oldest problem, and it's the same problem that exists everywhere in the Muslim world. This is a proxy war that's being fought out between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and it's coming to a head now after the Shia rebels took control of the capital in February. But this will be coming onto people's radars for the first time, but of course it has a very, very long history. They might know some little incidents within that history. They might remember the bombing of the USS Cole, which came from Aden, of course, back in 2000. But this will be coming onto most people's radars for the first time. And they won't realise that, as you say, it is the Shia-Sunni battle that has been taking place in Muslim countries all over the world for some time, and which is the biggest issue of our days.
Yeah, well, you wanted to mention oil, right? Just before that, I would say that 30 years ago, being myself from a Muslim country, there was almost no difference between Shias and Sunnis, not that you could see in everyday life. It's only in the past couple of decades that this has become an issue. That's just a little personal insight into this Shia-Sunni debate. So, sorry, Alice, you wanted to say something about oil?
No, I was just going to add that the implications of this obviously extend far beyond the parameters of the country itself, because with Saudi Arabia's involvement now, we've seen the price of oil spike. It jumped 6% in Asian trading. And it just really underlines how interconnected we all are, isn't it? And the international implications.
Well, yes, that's right. That'll be what hits people in the pocket if it has a knock-on effect to petrol prices, of course. But I don't think that's what people are really sort of focusing on with it, because the oil price has fallen so much this year as it is, that I think a 6% spike is not going to make a huge difference to people.
I suppose the question we're asking, is this a turnaround moment?
Well, possibly it is, but Adnan is quite right in bringing up the point that he does. If you look back 30 years and you look at photos of people in Tehran, women in Tehran, they're not dressed as they are today.
They were wearing jeans.
They were wearing jeans, and they probably weren't wearing headscarves. And now that has been a massive turnaround in the space of a generation, and you can see it all over Europe, you can see it in Britain, and it is a big issue of our times.
In the Wall Street Journal, the picture of Mariano Rajoy of Spain, Francois Hollande and Angela Merkel, all together there at the crash site. And Angela Merkel had invited any German relatives that if they wanted to come to the site, that they would be made welcome. And that is all officials can do. They can't do anything else.
Yeah, I mean, what's really terrifying about this crash site is just how little evidence debris, but it's very small debris, and you would expect with a plane crash to see a plane, and you can't. And I think that is terrifying. The story that's coming out from the recordings that we have of one of the pilots apparently being shut out of the cockpit is also terrifying, and it will lead to enormous speculation as to how he could have been shut out, and whether there are so many obvious things. I wouldn't like to speculate too much on where this is going to go. But the relatives, they're going to want some answers, what little comfort they're going to get from that.
Yeah, desperately sad, isn't it? Let's look at the front page now of the Financial Times. The biggest merger of this year is going to create this enormous food company, Heinz and Kraft, coming together. We were talking about it all day yesterday. Do you think this is a good move?
I think this is very interesting because these are, of course, two huge brands coming together. What this means for the consumer, I think this is, rich men playing games as rich men do. They're going to be putting together two enormous enterprises, and it's going to create the fifth largest. Will that make any difference to the consumer who's buying? Well, yes, some, because they'll be trying to revitalise some of these brands that are stuck in the 70s or 80s. But ultimately, the people won't know that these brands are behind the brands that they buy, and they will know even less that these big private equity companies that they know nothing about are behind the brands that are behind the brands. So I think for the man on the street, yes, and this is in the context of supermarkets doing their own brands, I think all the consumer will care about is whether prices go down and whether they can still buy the product that they want. Of course, it does have big knock-on implications for jobs, etc., as was proven when Kraft took over Cadbury a few years ago.
Yeah.
So that is a big issue for some people. But on the whole, the consumer is going to go into the supermarket and say, "Can I still buy my brand?" without knowing that Kraft or Heinz is behind it, and without knowing that Warren Buffett or another big Brazilian private equity firm that they've never heard of is behind that in turn.
Mm-hmm.
Even the International New York Times was talking about the BBC's Top Gear presenter.
Talking about
Well, it shows what a big story Top Gear and Jeremy Clarkson are. I feel sorry for the BBC on this one, I have to say, because Tony Hall had nowhere to go on this. I mean, wherever you stand on Clarkson himself, on the programme himself, the fact is that you can't be seen as an employer to condone what Clarkson did. So I don't think he had any option, Tony Hall, but to do what he did. Of course, it won't make a jot of difference to Jeremy Clarkson.
Yeah.
Jeremy Clarkson's going to be offered a contract by somebody
Yeah.
straight away. And it probably won't make that much difference to the viewers either, because they will see Clarkson come back, they'll see the Top Gear team come back. And I feel sorry for Tony Hall.
Okay, got 1 minute to go, so Mark, we'll leave it to you. What do you want to talk about? You want to talk about spies on Labour MPs?
I think the fact that Iraq and the Afghan wars are coming into history, I think, is interesting. When I was at school, there was a 30-year rule that you in order to be studied in history, it had to be 30 years before. I've actually just finished a degree myself in contemporary history.
All right, congratulations.
Looking at that, indeed, a mature student. And the Iraq War, I think to know some of the historical context is very important. What's interesting about that, of course, is we don't really know what happened with the Iraq War. We're still waiting for the inquiry to come out to tell us what the story is. But I think that, on the whole, people don't understand the historical context of the issues that we're debating today. And Yemen, as our first story, is an obvious example of that. And I think the more context that can be put into it, the better it is for everybody, because the greater the understanding will be.
More important than learning about the Tudors and the Plantagenets. And
well, interestingly, that also has a knock-on effect, and people don't think to themselves, okay, there's a reason behind that.
Well, Richard III is history itself, and it's history in the making today as he gets reburied. Mark Davies, thanks very much indeed. More news, business, and everything else in a few minutes. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye.